Hey everyone, Nubkeks here, and today, right on the cusp of stepping into the Shadowlands expansion, I want to take a trip down memory lane and I want to look back at BFA, specifically at what is nearly always the best part of every WoW expansion, the raiding scene. And I want to talk about the best of the best. What were the 10 top raid bosses across all of the raids in BFA? As always, I'm interested to know what you guys think as well. After you watch the list, let me know what bosses I left out that you think really should have been in. And also let me know which bosses you'd remove to make space for those other ones, because it's a pretty difficult thing to do. If you enjoy the video, let me know as well, because it might be fun to come back and, maybe you could do a top 10 worst raid bosses in BFA 2. Before we dive into our rankings though, I want to show you a couple of the different bosses you can fight in the sponsor of today's video, Raid Shadow Legends, and you can use my links in the description down below to download Raid on PC or on mobile. The first boss I want to show you is the Mekkatorque, and his Raging Bull passive is the core to doing this fight well. At the start of the fight, he has a Rage buff which lasts for 3 turns, and that increases his damage dealt by 400%. But once that buff expires, he becomes dazed for 1 turn, which increases the damage that he takes by 200%. So what you want to do is make sure you have enough healing, enough defenses to survive through his rage phase, and then have enough damage dealers there and still alive during his dazed phase to go in and finish him off. And even more exciting than that is the upcoming Doom Tower feature, which is going to have 120 floors, 12 secret rooms, 11 mini bosses, and then ultimately a final boss as well. If you want to check out Raid and start fighting in some of the dungeons and taking on many of the bosses in the game already, check out the links in the description below. If you follow the exclusive link down there, you're going to get a welcome pack that's going to give you 50,000 silver, 50 gems, 5 mystery shards, 1 energy refill, 1 day XP boost, and 1 bonus clan boss key, plus a free champion Hexweaver. A champion I actually use quite a bit as a sort of speed booster and healer for your squad. Claim those rewards in game once you follow my links down below. Click on your inbox icon up there in the top right hand corner of your screen. They'll be in there for the next 30 days only. In 10th place, I'm placing Uu'nat, the Harbinger of the Void. Uu'nat was the second and last boss of the Crucible of Storms mini-raid, which came out near the end of the Battle of M.O.T.H.E.R. And the thing Uu'nat is infamous for, and the reason that he makes this list, is that he is possibly the hardest boss ever created in World of Warcraft. European Guild Pieces claim the world first kill on Uu'nat after 731 attempts, by far the most attempts ever to kill any boss in the game. But what made Uu'nat so crazy difficult? Well, there's a couple of things. The first one is more of a meta issue, right? It's sort of outside the raid itself, which is that this was a small 2-boss raid at the end of a regular raid tier. Now, compared to a normal raid tier, you've got loads of bosses which are all dropping loot, and every single piece of loot is powering up your characters, and you can go in over a few weeks, gather that up and get stronger. With Uu'nat though, you were going in at the end of a raid tier. You were already basically as powerful as you could be going right into it. There was no way to get stronger. In the fight itself then, I think the most interesting mechanics were these 3 relics that you could pick up and use, and they tied into what was the entire theme of this mini raid, which was kiss curse items, things that helped you but also really hurt you. So for example, there was the Tempest Caller crown. You could pick this up and this would fire off a storm of annihilation, and this would help you kill the adds that would be spawning during the fight. But the downside was that this would do a massive chunk of damage to your raid team as well, and would even instantly kill players that drop below 25% health. The Trident of the Deep Ocean would create a big barrier that you could stand over, and it would absorb a big chunk of the damage coming in on you. But the downside was that if any of that shield remained when it came to the end, it would collapse and again do a massive chunk of damage to you based off of how much health the shield had remaining. Or finally, there was the Void Stone, and this enabled you to get rid of these pools that would be dropping under players periodically throughout the fight that would otherwise last permanently on the ground, because whenever you touched a pool, it would heal up Uu'nat, which was essentially going to be a wipe because it was such a tough DPS check. You weren't going to kill Uu'nat if you got any healing. So what you would have to do is pop the Void Stone, which would stop everything in the entire raid, including the players and the boss, from receiving any healing. and with that, you could then walk over these pools and absorb them, get rid of them, and Uu'nat wouldn't be healed. The mythic only mechanic that made this perhaps so insanely hard was unstable resonance. It would randomly pick 12 players and mark them with either Storm, Ocean, or Void for 15 seconds, and they would need to run to their matching relic, their corresponding relic, in that time. If they didn't reach it, they would explode and wipe the raid. If you touched a player who had a different relic type than you, a different mark than you would explode and wipe the raid. And of course, you're kept running out of space in this encounter. Those pools were dropping on the ground throughout the encounter. There were other boss abilities throughout the encounter, and you had to weave your way through all of that stuff and the other players perfectly every single time. One mistake, game over, you're gone. And when you put all that stuff together, that for me is why Uu'nat, I think, fits correctly as the 10th spot on this list. It deserves to be on the best bosses in BFA because it was so insanely hard, but that is also the reason that I think it shouldn't be higher. So few people actually ever beat this boss, or even attempted to fight this boss. I, for one, am actually really glad that there is content like this in the game, you know, something to aspire to. The highest level of challenge that you know is there, and that you can get to and you can beat if you become that good, if you put in that time and that work. It's kind of a funny thing, content adding value to the game, even if it's content that most people don't really do all that much. So there you go. Uu'nat, in my opinion, I think rank 10 fits well. In 9th place then, I'm putting M.O.T.H.E.R, the second boss of Uldir, the very first raid of the expansion. And in comparison to Uu'nat, who came before this, M.O.T.H.E.R is probably one of the bosses that the most players in the entire game killed. This was the very first raid of BFA, and M.O.T.H.E.R is the second boss of the raid. Of course, it was very easy, and it was something that most people were going to get to, but that didn't mean it was a bad boss. No, in fact, far from it. I think there's a lot of cool stuff going on here. My favorite thing about this is definitely the story of the fight, though, right? This is M.O.T.H.E.R, you know, it's the nice kind of robot lady, the nice Titan keeper type thing, and she's here to help you out, and she just wants to make sure that there's no corruption getting into the Titan facility. So it's nice, you know, it's like your own mother asking you to wipe your shoes before you come into the house, right? It's fine. How is she going to help you out? How is she going to do this? Well, you know, she's going to try use wind tunnels to throw you into a fiery pit. She's going to call down Resident Evil style laser beams to cut across the room and murder you. And if you don't get out of the room with her quickly enough, she's going to set the entire room on fire in purifying flames that will instantly kill everyone and everything inside of it. Yeah, I bet your mother asking you to wipe your shoes before you come into the house doesn't seem so bad now. The defining mechanic of the M.O.T.H.E.R fight, though, was of course the defense grid. Fought M.O.T.H.E.R across 3 different rooms, but the entranceway between each room was blocked by a force field. Now, the interesting thing was that this did block line of sight, so you couldn't damage her or heal your allies through that force field. And when you walked through it, this force field would emit this pulse of damage that would hurt everyone in the raid. So if everyone simply walked through together in a panic to escape the room before it went on fire, all of that damage from that force field would murder the entire raid group. So there were a couple of ways to deal with this. Either you could have everyone move through at a slow and steady pace, so an orderly line of people slowly passing through into the next room and spacing that damage out well. And that was the strategy that most people used at the start. Or then the other big strategy you could use was the cheese strategy, where everyone would stack under the gateway, right? You would place down all of your defensive cooldowns, you know, Discipline Priest barriers, Shaman Spirit Links, Warriors would do their rallying cry, everything would be popped, all defensives, and everyone would walk through together. Massive explosion of damage would go out, a massive pulse of healing, loads of damage reduction, and you'd make it through just fine. And you know, I love that about the fight, that there's a couple of ways to handle it. You can be a little bit creative. And yeah, it was just such a visually cool and iconic thing. I think it's definitely a fight that you will remember for many years to come. So yeah, M.O.T.H.E.R, I think for me, is in 9th position. In 8th place, I'm putting the Queen's Court, the 6th boss of the Eternal Palace raid. This is a fight that I think a lot of people will overlook, a lot of people will underestimate, because I think that mythic difficulty was where this fight really made sense. It wasn't that good on looking for raid or normal or heroic, and even in the Race to World First, there was a bug, one of the hardest mechanics of the fight, the charge that one of the bosses would do, that essentially nullified it. So even people watching those streams will have missed out on what made this fight so fun. What made this fight so interesting was that it tied into the whole theme of, well, a Queen's Court, right? That there were procedures, that there were rules, that there were rituals that you had to do. The most iconic thing about this fight was the decrees. Queen Azshara was there, right, watching over the fight and issuing decrees to you. There were 5 decrees, and on mythic difficulty, These switched every 30 seconds. You had no downtime at all. You would always move from one decree into another one. And also on Mythic difficulty, these were represented by flags around the room, around the edges of the room, and when the decree activated, that flag would activate and prevent you from standing anywhere near it. It basically took up that half of the room, which meant that you're always cycling around the room and dealing with these mechanics. The first decree was form ranks, and this had the theme of standing in a formation. There'd be a number of soak circles would appear on the ground. You had to stand in these soak circles within a few seconds, or they would explode and murder you. The second decree, repeat performance, was a bit annoying, to be honest. This would silence anyone that used the same ability twice in a row. Something that you could basically ignore with some classes and ruined other classes entirely. The third decree was a really nasty one. It was called stand alone, where you had to essentially stand alone. There'd be pulsing damage coming out of every single player, so you all had to be reasonably well spread out. The fourth decree was deferred sentence. You kept building up a debuff when you were standing still, and whenever you moved, it would consume all the stacks to nuke you for damage. Right? So you had to keep moving every few stacks to make sure it never built up too much to become lethal. And then finally there was Obey or Suffer, which would give you a suffering debuff, making you immune to all healing for 5 seconds whenever you took damage, but then once it expired you were immune to that debuff for 5 seconds, so basically it alternated between 5 seconds where you were able to be healed, and 5 seconds where you couldn't get any healing at all. And what made this even more interesting was that you were fighting 2 bosses at the same time, right? And these bosses had to be split up. You had the male boss who was all about physical attacks, and the female boss who was all about magic attack. And it was how their abilities would overlap with the different decrees that made it pretty spooky. So for example, the male boss had a charge ability where he would choose one player on the raid, charge to them, and that would split the damage of the charge amongst all the players that were there to absorb it. Could this happen during standalone where players weren't able to stack up? Yes, it could. It absolutely could. So you had to have a fixed position with fixed players positioned and spread correctly around it to absorb that charge. Even worse was his ability, Zealous Eruption, which would essentially mean that he made a bubble around himself. You had to stand within that bubble, and anyone outside of it would be nuked for massive damage, right? Could that happen during standalone? Yes, of course it could happen during standalone, in which case, again, you'd have to have everyone pre-stacked, pre-positioned, ready to go, or else, again, you would all die horribly. The female boss had some nasty spells as well. One of them was Potent Spark, where she'd summon in 3 sparks around the room that would slowly lose life. When they ran out of life, they would explode, do a massive chunk of damage to the raid, and they would also leave a debuff on you, where if you got hit by another Potent Spark explosion, within a few seconds, you take massively increased damage. So what that meant was the DPS players had to coordinate and kill off these potent sparks, help them to die so that the explosions would be staggered out enough that you would never get one shot from that debuff. The crucial thing that brings all of this together was that everything was scripted, as, something like courtly rituals should be. Everything happened on a set timer. It happened in the exact same order every time, so you knew exactly what was going to happen. And it was all about just performing the fight correctly, performing these rituals correctly for Queen Azshara. So you can have a clear-cut plan, keep developing that plan with every pull, and once players learn the fight, they learn the moves, they learn the rituals, they can get through it and you can execute the fight properly. So yeah, there you go, guys. That was the Queen's Court. For me, an absolutely awesome fight, one that I thoroughly enjoyed, and I think a fight as well that probably a lot of people will overlook, a lot of people will dismiss, but for me, a standout from this expansion, no question. In 7th place then, I have Opulence, the 4th boss of the Battle of Dazar'alor raid. So the boss itself was this giant elemental made out of gold coins and gems and everything. Really interesting, really visually cool. But to get to that boss, you had to do this Indiana Jones style entryway, right? Where you had to fight through a bunch of different trap rooms fighting these mini bosses to make it to the boss. If you try to run just directly towards the boss into the treasure vault itself, the boss would be super buffed and would instantly murder you. Oh, and one of the coolest parts, of course, I almost forgot to mention this, was that to get through these trap rooms, you had to go through 2 sides. So you had to split your raid team in half, with half going down one path and half going down the other one. And there were several traps during these trap rooms that could catch and kill you. There were flame jets that could come out of the walls and incinerate you. There was a room that applied poison that the healers would have to heal through. There were magic debuffs, hexes that had to be dispelled by the healers. And there were laser beams that would target players, chase them around the room and leave these scorching ground patches behind them. The 2 mini bosses would also have a few abilities. So one of them would put volatile charge debuffs on players. This would put this big lightning ball attached to them, and after 8 seconds it would drop onto the ground and stay there permanently, pulsing out some very heavy damage. So you had to stack these intelligently around the room so that, well, they wouldn't get in the way of people trying to avoid the traps. The boss on the right hand path, the Yalat's Bulwark, would be casting Flames of Punishment, where he would plant his feet, and then start spinning around the room, shooting fire out in front of him in a cone. So you had to run around behind him and make sure to dodge it. Get to the end of these 2 corridors, and you would find jewel rooms, where you could take jewels that would power you up based on a number of different effects. So for the tanks, they could take the Diamond of the Unshakable Protector, which would give them a massive shield, enabling them to actually tank Opulence, tank the main boss itself. The healers had a couple of different ones. The most important one was the Amethyst of the Shadow King, which gave them 50% haste permanently and let their spells apply a shadow-touched buff, which would protect players from shadow magic. This is really important because, well, Opulence itself would be pulsing out shadow magic, and anyone that took a gem would get a curse that would punish them and zap them for a big chunk of shadow magic, you know, on mythic difficulty, instantly killing you unless you were protected by the shadow touch debuff. So that became the main job of the Amethyst healer, was to protect people from shadow damage. The other healers could take the Tailwind Sapphire, which would make their healing spells apply the Tailwind's buff to their targets, right, that they healed, that would increase their damage done, and you could stack that up. For the DPS, there were 4 different jewels you could take. The most important one probably was the Ruby. With the Ruby, you could apply a debuff, stack it up on the boss that would increase the boss's damage taken. Now this was very important that you have a few rubies throughout your raid, because if the player with a ruby had to run out to deal with one of the boss's mechanics, that debuff could fall off and then your damage would be absolutely crippled. So really important to keep that ruby debuff stacked. Maybe the least interesting one was the Emerald of Earthen Roots. This gave you a buff called Earthen Roots while you stood still. That gave you 1% damage done per stack, up to 30% more damage, but once you moved, those stacks would fall off very quickly. The Opal of Unleashed Rage on mythic difficulty was typically the biggest damage dealing jewel that you could give to players. This would give you a permanent 2% damage increase whenever you dealt damage to a new enemy, and this could stack up again permanently. And of course, Opulence would be summoning in waves of adds throughout the fight, so whenever an add wave came in, you hit them with an AoE spell, you would permanently get a big chunk of damage done for the rest of the fight to really help you execute out the boss. And then maybe the most involved gem was the Topaz of Brilliant Sunlight. This gave the player a stack of a buff called Incandescence whenever they were standing away from every other player, right? So you'd have a few different players would take up a Topaz, and they'd have to stand outside of the group, away from everyone else. They would build up their buff. Now when they hit 100 stacks, they gained the grossly incandescent aura for 20 seconds, which would buff everyone nearby with 100% crit chance, right? So you would charge up this buff, then go stack in with your team and give everyone that crit chance. And again, you'd have to have your players with that Topaz coordinate with each other so that they wouldn't overlap their buffs, because, you know, 100% crit chance, that doesn't stack. It's 100%. 100%'s 100%. Opulence himself, the boss, then, he wasn't actually all that complicated. He would give a molten gold debuff to players. You'd go and drop a pool of this liquid gold on the floor, and then periodically throughout the fight, he would cast a spell that would make that molten gold, those pools, expand. So it did make it important that you drop those pools of gold in the right places. Otherwise, when they grew, you could find yourself stuck on these burning pools of molten hot gold and quickly find yourself wiping. So as you can see, there is an awful lot of really cool stuff happening with Opulence. It's just such a cool idea for the fight, you know, splitting your raid into 2 teams, working your way through these traps, grabbing these really interesting gems that changed up your playstyle, and then, you know, a relatively simple boss at the end of it, but a cool visual boss, using those gem powers to take him down. In 6th place then, I'm putting Ra-Den. This was one of the end of wing bosses, one of the final bosses from Ny'alotha, the final raid of BFA. Now I'm going to talk you through the mythic version of this fight, because I think on mythic, this is where it gets a lot more interesting. He's a much better boss on mythic. There are 3 different orbs that could spawn around the room: Void, Vita, and Nightmare. Now you could choose to kill any one of these orbs at a time, and that would then empower Ra-Den with the powers of the 2 surviving orbs. What did these debuffs do? Well, for Nightmare, which would be considered the easiest orb to deal with, this would place an unstable Nightmare debuff that would bounce around your raid, right? So this would create this big AoE circle around a player that would explode after a few seconds, doing a big chunk of damage to anyone in the circle, and then that debuff would jump to the nearest player. So very simply, we had a drop-off point assigned for the Nightmare debuff, and then you'd have the next player assigned to take up that Nightmare debuff, run over to the edge of the circle, and be ready to pick it up when it expired. Then they would go drop it off at the drop-off point, the next player would come over to pick it up, and so on. The Nightmare ad that would spawn in would create these volcanoes that would essentially chase players around the room, so you just have to run away from that and make sure not to drag this volcano exploding over your teammates and start wiping them out. The Vita orb was certainly the one that caused us the the most trouble, this would give you unstable Vita. So this was an electric debuff. And what it would do, it would shoot a bolt of lightning, transferring the debuff to the player who was furthest away from you. So you would have to have a group of players assigned to pick up this debuff. So for example, player 1 would have to go and drop it far off to the left-hand side of the room. Player 2 would have to be ready and move far off to the right-hand side. Make sure there was no players in between them to get caught in that lightning bolt, or else those players would die. Then the debuff would jump across. Player 1 would run back into the middle of the room, group up with the raid again. Player 3 would have to run across then to the left-hand side where player 1 used to be ready to catch the debuff, which is now on the right-hand side with player 2. And yeah, you get the idea. Essentially, this would just be kind of bounced back and forth. Vita adds that would spawn in then, would just spam some chain lightning casts on the raid, just did a bit of raid damage. That was basically it. The hardest debuff to deal with was considered to be the void debuff, right? This would give you an unstable void blob, which would basically bounce around the room. This would leave this sort of swirly circle on the ground. You could see where it was going to land. You'd have to have a player stand in that circle to soak it, and then it would bounce in whatever direction the player was looking. So pretty simply, we would have them just look at the wall and just keep bouncing the ball against the wall, so it was very easy. It was always in the same spot every time. The Void ad then, the Void Hunter, was considered the most difficult one because his ability, Void Collapse, would target a random player, and then after 3.5 seconds, this would explode, do a massive chunk of damage to anyone within that circle, and also prevent them from taking healing. But because this was always baited onto the largest group of players, you could have all players with immunities, right? So like Demon Hunters with Netherwalk, Paladins with Divine Shield, and so on, have them all be stacked up together, and then, you know, they would bait the ability onto them, walk out, absorb it with Ice Block or whatever, then try to kill that ad as quickly as possible so you wouldn't get any more of these Void Collapses. So lots of stuff going on there, but as you can see, individually dealing with it is pretty simple. Like, if you're assigned to the Vita, you don't need to worry about the Nightmare. You don't need to worry about the Void, right? You ignore that stuff. You're going to be doing the Vita. You're bouncing that lightning debuff between the two furthest players. So you need to make sure that you're on the right side at the right time to grab that debuff. And that's your job. You do that correctly, you're all good. The fun thing on Mythic, of course, is that you've got two of these debuffs going at the same time, right? So you've got players trying to bounce the Nightmare debuff, the big circle that would jump to the closest player, while you also have players trying to bounce the Vita debuff, on top of having the two ads coming in and doing their abilities, on top of the boss who's, you know, fighting the tanks as well. So you had lots of stuff going on at the same time. You had to have everybody just focusing in on their job, doing it well. And it was relatively simple to do your own individual job well. And so long as you did that correctly, you could get through the fight, through phase 1 anyway, and do a good job. Of course, there was also a phase 2, which would end the whole orb mechanics and the debuff mechanics, and Ra-Den would just start, you know, beating the crap out of you. There'd be lots of raid damage going out, lots of nasty debuffs as well, where if you got healed to max health, you would instantly die. Fun stuff like that, you know, fun stuff like that. It was very intense, though, race to the end to kill Ra-Den before he killed you, while everyone had to be hovering kind of on medium health. It was intense and very, very cool. So for me, definitely Ra-Den was a wonderful boss to progress on, a wonderful boss to fight. Just really fun dealing with those different mechanics, having everyone with their little job, and then a great boss burn at the end to kill him off. It was a quick fight too. It was a very, very short fight. So short, sweet, Ra-Den, definitely a winner. And that earns the 6th place in the list. In 5th place then, I have a very spicy choice here, which is Mekkatorque. Yes, the leader of the gnomes, the 7th boss of the Battle of Dazar'alor raid. So what was going on with Mekkatorque? Well, there was a number of things going on. If I cover the more minor things first, then we'll get to the big thing, the controversial part of this fight. So he would be doing, you know, a number of fairly standard boss type things, right? So he'd put gigavolt charges. He'd put a debuff these bombs on random players that would explode and damage everyone in line of sight. How did you deal with that? Well, there would be 3 blocks of rubble around the room that you could hide behind, right? So everyone would run to their assigned side of the room, hide behind their rubble, let the bomb go off, they take damage, but nobody else would be hit. Fairly straightforward, not too bad. He also would have a Buster Cannon attack where he'd choose a random player, shoot a massive cannon blast towards them, which would basically one-shot anyone that got hit by it. So, you know, again, just dodge the big laser blast, all good. One of the nastier mechanics that he would have on higher difficulties was the wormhole generator, where he'd mark a random player for 5 seconds, and after 5 seconds it would teleport everyone in the raid on top of that player. So that could have some nasty overlaps, like you could have the bombs go out, which needed to be behind rubble, and then the teleport would come out really quickly after that. So those poor players would be teleported back in and would have to really leg it to drop their bomb off in the right spot before it went off. But yeah, on Mythic difficulty for sure, this got pretty nasty because after the wormhole generator, a few players would be randomly flung up into the air, a few players would be randomly polymorphed into sheep, and the boss would then attempt to jump with a big AoE attack onto where he just teleported you, so any poor old sheep caught in that would die. And, you know, for players who were thrown into the air, well, if you didn't have a way to get down, you could die from falling damage. Pretty nasty, right? The poor shaman in the raid had no way to deal with that, you know, compared to demon hunters who could glide or mages who could blink and so on. So you had some creative ways to handle it, right? You could have your priests help out and do mass dispels to save people that were polymorphed, or just life grip, you know, leap of faith people out of the air to keep them safe. Your mages could put on slow fall, priests could levitate players down. There are lots of creative ways of handling it. But of course, that's all just gravy, right? The big thing, the meat and potatoes of this fight, was the robot mechanic. Periodically throughout the fight, Mekkatorque would summon in a couple of spark bots. These spark bots would just wander around, you couldn't deal damage to them, and they just keep emitting pulses of electricity. Kind of dangerous by themselves, actually. On the higher difficulties, you'd need to have druids working together to keep entangling roots going on these guys for mass entanglement, to keep them locked down so they couldn't walk all over your team and murder them. You could also use things like Death Knights with grips, or again, druids with knockbacks, that sort of thing, to position the spark bots in the right places, right? So they weren't going to get in your way, and then lock them down with the roots. So there was some interesting and fun coordination going on there. The most important thing, though, was that after summoning in 3 waves of these spark bots, Mekkatorque would then shrink a number of players. Now, those shrunk players would basically do no damage, and if a normal player walked over them, it would essentially almost instantly kill them. So, had to be very careful, don't run over them. Also nasty when that overlapped with a wormhole. Not good. Everyone stacked together, all the shrunk people crushed, stampeded to death under the panicked regular raiders. But the interesting thing about being shrunk was that you could climb inside of a spark bot and then you could defuse it. In order to defuse it, you had to input a code, a color code, right? That color code would be displayed above your head. So on the lower difficulties, like on Looking for Raid, you could very simply just see your own code and input your own code. It was all good, no stress. However, on higher difficulties, you couldn't see the code above your own head. So how the hell did you do it? Well, you'd have to have a number of players get into the spark bots and then tell each other over voice chat what their codes were. So, you know, like player 1 would get in and say, player 2, you're red. Player 2 would say, player 1, you're blue. Player 2, you're green. Player 1, you're also green. Player 2, you're red. Again, player 2, you're purple. Okay, cool, great. Yeah, we're all sorted. Press your buttons now, input the code, and jump out. You're all good. But of course, it gets even more complicated because you'd have, 3 players at a time be trying to do this, or perhaps even more. So it could be a real hassle, right? This is either something you would love or hate. I think this is why this is such a controversial placement, right? Because it was very hectic. There's an awful lot going on right there. You have to have players be good at communicating, be quick at communicating, be comfortable. And of course, don't forget that while this is happening, all the normal raid mechanics are going on at the same time, which meant that, like as a raid leader, you couldn't really start shouting out raid mechanics and telling people what to do because you would overwrite, you get in the way of the poor dudes in the robots trying to figure out their codes and communicate with each other. So yeah, for me, I think this is one of the most unique things they've ever done. Just really interesting, really different. I can understand though, if some people would even place this boss on their worst bosses. I could understand some people absolutely hating this, definitely, like I'm in Europe, right? So definitely you could have some language barriers there where for people that find it difficult to talk, that could be a challenge. I mean, we even had a couple of players at the time in our raid that were mute, that literally can't talk. So definitely a tough boss for those players, not entirely fair. But at the same time, for me, this still has to be, I think, a really highly ranked boss just because it was so intense. There was so much going on. And I felt that, they experimented with a few different bosses over the course of this expansion. And generally speaking, I hated those experiment bosses. But for me, Mekkatorque actually ended up being a lot of fun. So there you go, guys. For me, Mekkatorque does come in at number 5. In the number 4 spot, then, is Carapace of N'Zoth, the 11th and penultimate boss in Ny'alotha, the final raid of BFA. And for me, the Carapace of N'Zoth really summed up, the essence of what a big end of tier, end of raid boss should be like, or well, second to end of raid boss. So you had 3 different phases in this fight. In phase 1, you were fighting the Carapace of N'Zoth outside of N'Zoth's body itself. The main mechanic that was happening during this phase was these giant tentacles that would emerge from the ground, and you'd see this big shadow stretching across the ground. They would then slam down and just cut off, right? Just form a wall throughout the arena. arena. So you'd have to have your raid split into a number of teams, spread out around these tentacles, and you'd have to attack these hemorrhages, these growths on the side of the tentacles. Once all of the growths were popped, the tentacle would then retreat and you could continue with the fight as normal. At the same time, they'd be spewing out lots of ads. There are also these I-beam tentacles that would come out of the ground as well, which would do an awful lot of damage to your team that you had to kill very quickly. Yeah, it was a relatively simple phase, but I think visually kind of cool and fun to sort of split up your raid to the different sides. Once you lower the Carapace of N'Zoth's health low enough, you then enter N'Zoth's body itself. So you go down this tunnel, and then at this point, certainly on Mythic difficulty, you'd have to split your raid into 2 teams to go down 2 different sides of this inner chamber. And each side of this chamber was essentially a mini gauntlet of sorts, where there'd be these big cysts, these big growths on the wall that you would have to pop as you were going, right? So each team is going down each side of the room, popping these growths on the walls. To make things difficult, there were also growths on the floor that would be spreading out this big slowing field on the ground, but you could kill those cysts on the floor. You could lower their health, which would shrink the growth on the floor and let you walk through that space freely. The Carapace was also doing some fairly nasty things like dropping mind bombs on people, so they'd have to walk out of the raid group, make sure not to drop it on top of them. And you'd have to be careful though of the cysts that you'd previously killed, because after a certain amount of time, the cysts that you previously killed would then erupt in a big AoE of damage, sort of, you know, this explosion, this line of explosions sort of chasing you down the gauntlet. It was quite cool. Once you had popped all the cysts along the walls, interestingly enough, on Mythic difficulty, you just go straight on through into the next room and into phase 3, whereas on lower difficulties, you actually had a sort of intermission phase, right, where you'd actually fight Carapace at the bottom of that second room for a little bit of time. Now, you wouldn't really do too much. It was kind of a chill cooldown period, let everyone regroup, let everyone get ready before entering the final phase. In the final phase, you'd actually be fighting in the room where you would ultimately face the final boss of the expansion, N'Zoth. Now, this was a big circular room, and to understand like the core mechanics of this phase, I think you have to think about it as just a big old pizza, right? It's cut into 4 different slices, and those slices were all separated. The cuts of the slice were these lines of cysts. Because what was happening during this was, as you were fighting the Carapace, you would periodically cast this infinite darkness ability, which would put this massive pool on the ground, and this pool would be lethal if you stood in it for too long. So essentially what you would do is you would drop this pool in the middle of the first slice of pizza, and then use something like a Warlock Gateway or a Windrush Totem, a big movement ability, to move your entire raid across. You'd have range DPS take out the cysts to clear out that space, make it through into the next pizza slice, and then you'd be fighting Carapace in that next pizza slice, and then, you know, rinse and repeat, right? Fight him for a while there, he'd do another infinite darkness, move on to the next slice, and so on, and you had to kill him, you had to DPS him down on time before you ultimately ran out of space entirely. There are also some fairly nasty mechanics going on here. Mind Bomb was definitely the biggest one, where he'd put a bomb on everyone's head, which would explode and do a big chunk of damage, and indeed sanity damage, to everyone that was standing nearby. This meant that you had to spread out through the entirety of the slice, right? You're quite limited on space. Make sure that everyone was spread out perfectly before those bombs went off, otherwise you could find yourself in big trouble. But yeah, once it came down to it, Carapace of N'Zoth wasn't actually the hardest boss. In terms of tuning, this is the downside of this boss. It was a little bit easier than I think most of us had expected it to be, which was a little bit of a disappointment. But for me, that doesn't take away from just being this really cool boss, with 3 very different and interesting phases, this awesome visuals to the fight as well, and just this sense of epicness that I think really encapsulates what raiding is about in World of Warcraft. In third place then, for the best bosses of BFA, I'm placing King Rastakhan. King Rastakhan was the 6th boss of the Battle of the Zarlor raid, and I think this is actually where it's quite interesting and sort of defines both this biggest strength and the biggest weakness of this fight, right? Because in Battle of the Zarlor, the first 3 raid bosses were shared between Alliance and Horde. Then the middle 3 bosses were Horde bosses that you fought as the Alliance. Then the final 3 bosses were Alliance bosses that you fought as the Horde. Now, if you were a part of the opposite faction, you know, in order to fight the Horde bosses as Alliance, Horde players would be, you know, race changed into Alliance. You know, like within the raid itself, it was essentially that you were playing through a story that was being told to you by one of your scouts. And I kind of wonder if in the initial design of this raid, if they had intended both of those paths, both the Horde and Alliance path, to be equally difficult, and then to end in an equally epic end boss. Because as you'll see, in terms of his design, King Rastakhan absolutely had all of the qualities of an end-of-tier boss. However, in terms of difficulty, and this is really the only criticism I have of this fight, in terms of difficulty, Once they rearranged it and had him be simply the 6th boss out of 9, he definitely has a difficulty that reflected that, which was certainly a little bit of a disappointment. But what was going on in the King Rastakhan fight? What made this fight so damn good? Well, believe it or not, like any good end boss, Rastakhan had actually 4 distinct phases to the fight. In the first phase, you arrive in this grand throne chamber with Rastakhan waiting on the throne and his 3 bodyguards in front of him. And you would start fighting these bodyguards, which had some, nasty abilities. One of them would smack the tank, one of them would start chasing players with the laser beam, that sort of thing. Now, during phase 1, Rastakhan would descend from the throne, talking to the players, and then eventually start fighting you as well. Although he was immune to damage in this phase, any damage that he took would be absorbed by his bodyguards. Get through phase 1, and then the real fight would truly begin. In phase 2, Rastakhan summons in M.O.T.H.E.R, the Loa of Death, to fight alongside of him. And in order to take this down, you'd have to have one of your tanks take M.O.T.H.E.R off to the side and tank him away from the group, because M.O.T.H.E.R would exude this aura of death, which would keep stacking up a debuff that inflicted more and more and more shadow damage. For most tank classes, you'd have to tank swap, right? This would get too dangerous. For some tank classes like Protection Paladin, for example, they could actually cheese this and solo tank it, and that was something that definitely some top guilds experimented with, using things like Divine Shields to reset stacks or Blessing of Spell Warding. On Mythic difficulty as well, the Aura of Death was even larger, which meant that even the healers that went to heal the tank, tanking M.O.T.H.E.R, would start taking stacks as well, so even the healers would need to rotate a little bit to make sure they didn't get too much of this debuff. In the meantime, most of the raid is fighting King Rastakhan himself. So he's doing a Plague of Toads, where he throws out a bunch of frogs which start hopping across the room. Excuse me, not frogs, they're toads, they're a different thing. But these frogs would apply a nasty poison to anyone that touched them, and they would even leave long-lasting poison pools on the ground. On higher difficulties, he'd summon in a totem, which would mind control one of the players nearby. Now, you'd have to kill this totem off or use a shaman with a tremor totem to break people out of this instantly. And also, be careful that while you're killing the totem, you don't accidentally kill your poor friendly player that is temporarily only fighting for the enemy. Perhaps the biggest raid wipe mechanic though is the Plague of Fire, where Rastakhan would put a Plague of Fire on some random players. This was a medium-sized circle that very quickly would expire, but the thing was that if anyone was nearby, it would spread to that player. So if your raid wasn't spread properly, what would start off as just a couple of these little debuffs could very quickly, like wildfire, hey, there you go, spread throughout your entire raid and become extremely difficult to get rid of while doing massive damage. And then finally, a mechanic that would tie in crucially to the rest of the fight was the Death's Door mechanic. M.O.T.H.E.R would apply Death's Door to a random player, and after 8 seconds, this would create a Death Rift at the player's location, and this would come in to the later parts of the fight. Now, the interesting thing on Mythic difficulty was that you would actually create a wall of Death's Doors at the entrance to the room, at the doorway, to enable you to sort of cheese the 3rd phase. Bring King Rastakhan's health low enough, and you enter phase 3, where M.O.T.H.E.R sucks half of the raid into the Death Realm with him, while the other half of the raid remains in the normal realm fighting King Rastakhan. For half the team in the Death Realm, M.O.T.H.E.R is finally able to be damaged, and you have to bring him to half health before, well, you all die. Death Rifts, which I talked about before, are now spewing out what are essentially evil watermelons of death, which travel across the room and do a chunk of damage if you touch them. Pretty nasty. And this is where the Mythic cheese mechanic came into play, because what you would do, right, is you would build a wall of Death Rifts at the entrance to the room, right, in the doorway. Because these Death Rifts had one interesting mechanic, which was that any of the watermelons that they shot out would be absorbed if they touched another Death Rift. So by hiding in behind a wall of these Death Rifts, you'd be protected from most of these watermelons that were traveling around the room, thereby really lowering the incoming damage of the raid. Of course, M.O.T.H.E.R was in the middle of the room, so what this meant was that you'd have to have 9 ranged DPS standing behind this wall with a Resto Shaman. Resto Shaman obviously excelling at stacked AoE healing, so they were the best healer spec for keeping everyone alive in this Death Realm. Once M.O.T.H.E.R was brought to half health, then he would flee from the fight, and the players in the Death Realm would return up to the Living Realm, and you would all then focus down on King Rastakhan. And this final phase was quite an exciting burn phase, actually. You have all these Death Doors continuing to spawn around the room, and these are continuing to spew out all of those watermelons of death. So you've got these random watermelons traveling all over the room. King Rastakhan still throwing these poison toads everywhere. The tanks are still exploding for damage. There's still the Plagues of Fire going on that you need to spread out for. All this stuff going on. You're trying to wear him down before you get taken out. Very fun burn phase. And yeah, and that for me is what makes King Rastakhan so cool. You know, the weakness of this fight certainly was the tuning. You know, it wasn't that crazy hard, right? It wasn't as hard as an end boss, which he easily could have been. But at the same time, I do think that him being, you know, only 6th boss difficulty, it made him a really fun fight to progress on. It wasn't overly punishing. You know, you could kind of enjoy it a bit more than a very stressful end boss might be. And just appreciate all the stuff that's going on in this fight, appreciate the story, the lore, the setting. It was so damn cool. And yeah, like I said, I really don't think that even him being a little bit undertuned compared to what he could have been, I still don't think that takes away from the awesome design of this fight, and obviously including King Rastakhan and Bwonsamdi, two of the most interesting characters from obviously the Horde side story of this entire BFA expansion. I think that if this had been tuned up to be end boss difficulty, this even could have been the best boss of the expansion. I really do think it's that good. So there you are, guys. I'm putting Rastakhan in at number 3. In the number 2 spot then, again, I think this one is going to be a very controversial position, but I do stand by it, right? I stand by this because, hey, you know, this is the internet where people are just very understanding, full of compassion. They're eager. They're eager to hear varying opinions that are different from their own, and just appreciate those different perspectives on life. Definitely no harsh criticisms here. No, sir. This is going to be fine. But yeah, in number 2, I'm putting N'Zoth. N'Zoth is the final boss of the Ny'alotha raid, the final raid of BFA, and this is the fight that really crowns the end of the expansion. One of the things that I really liked about N'Zoth was I thought it was a great homage, a great throwback to the old gods that we had fought before in World of Warcraft. You know, Cthulhu in classic WoW, and Yogg-Saron in Wrath of the Lich King. It has those classic hallmarks, right, where you've got the old god itself kind of stuck in the center of the room, and you're spread around the room fighting them, this circular room. They're summoning in tentacles to fight you. They're summoning in these faceless aberration minions to fight you. And you even have this mind phase, which mirrors the interior phase of Cthulhu or the mind phase of Yogg-Saron. You've got this other phase that you go into, which makes the boss vulnerable. I really enjoyed all those throwbacks. I thought that was really appropriate. Definitely one of the weaknesses of N'Zoth is that on the lower difficulties, I think that this fight is an awful lot weaker. I certainly think it's on Mythic difficulty, where this fight actually really comes together and actually starts to make sense and become a fight that is good enough, in my opinion, to claim this number 2 spot for BFA. In phase 1 of the fight, in part 1 of the fight, you essentially split your raid into 2 different teams. One of the teams is going to stay up in the normal realm, fighting the tentacles that N'Zoth is spawning in and dealing with some of the mechanics that he's throwing at you to screw with your minds. So one of the most iconic of these is Paranoia, where basically everyone in the raid is linked with another player, and you have to reach that player really, really quickly, because while you're separated, you're going to take extremely heavy damage. However, if you touch any other player while afflicted by Paranoia, you start draining sanity from that player. And sanity is this extra mechanic throughout the entire N'Zoth fight, this resource that you have to maintain, that you have to keep up, because if you run out of sanity, you succumb to the madness of N'Zoth. You get about 20 seconds of doing double damage. Great, you can power that into N'Zoth, but after those 20 seconds, you become permanently mind controlled and join N'Zoth's side against your team. Now, on Mythic difficulty in particular, these Paranoia effects often overlap a Mind Grasp effect, where N'Zoth will attempt to pull you off of one side of the room. So you have to organize with your team, stack up with your Paranoia buddy, avoid everybody else, stack up, for example, on the inside of the room so that when you're pulled towards the outside, you don't you're far enough away so you don't get pulled off. While all this is going on in the normal realm, the other team, the other half of the raid, is going to enter the Psychus realm, the Mind realm. And in the Mind realm, you're going to fight a mini-boss called Psychus. Now, Psychus has an absolute ton of health, so what you need to do is drag him towards these synapses. These are these tentacles in the Mind realm. When you kill a synapse, it will do a psychic shock that will debuff Psychus and increase his damage taken. So this sort of defines the Mind phase, right? You're dragging Psychus from synapse to synapse, killing them off, stacking up that debuff until he's going to be able to take enough damage that you can focus him down and finish him off, then escape the Mind phase. Get through 2 Psychus phases and you move into the second part of the fight, into phase 2. Big mechanic of phase 2 though was Evoke Anguish. With this cast, N'Zoth would put a really nasty debuff on everyone in the raid, and after 8 seconds, that debuff would drop a pool of anguish on the ground. Again, these are the pools that drain a huge amount of insanity and do massive damage to you, and these pools grow over time, and they also last permanently for the entirety of the rest of the fight. And this was definitely the most interesting part of phase 2, right? N'Zoth would cast up to 8 of these Evoke Anguishes total, which would always leave these permanent patches on the ground taken up. So you had to plan out every single Evoke Anguish, have every single member of your raid assigned to drop their Evoke Anguish in a very specific space so that you'd have enough space left at the end of the fight that you wouldn't be forced to stand in anguish and just die. To make it even more difficult, of course, there'd be other mechanics which would overlap with this one. One nasty one were laser beams, right? N'Zoth would spawn 4 eyes at random points around his body, which would then spin around his body, shooting these laser beams across the room. If you got hit by a laser beam, you'd take massive damage and be feared, almost essentially a death. And this would come out very, very quickly, or even while you were dropping off these Evoke Anguishes. So you had to be ready and instantly watching and moving and adapting to these new positions that Evoke Anguish pools could be appearing while still dodging this laser. Another cheeky one would be that he'd cast Paranoia right after he dropped an Evoke Anguish. So suddenly everyone is sort of racing to get away from these Anguish pools, from their pre-assigned positions, and you're going to be matched with a random other person in the raid. You need to get to them as quickly as possible before you all horribly die without touching other players, lest you run out of sanity. And for me, this is very enjoyable because it's planned out, it's scripted. All of these abilities always come overlapping each other in the same way. So once you learn where to move, you learn how to deal with it, you can conquer this phase. Once you get through 4 sets of these Evoke Anguishes and 2 sets of Paranoia, this is where N'Zoth activates his Mythic phase. And this is the reason for me that N'Zoth is definitely only rank 2 at most, because the Mythic phase for N'Zoth, the secret phase, was a huge disappointment. For the Mythic phase, you'd actually temporarily leave the N'Zoth boss fight and travel through a portal to the heart of Azeroth, where N'Zoth is attempting to corrupt Magni and Mother. And the problem with this phase was that it was just really, really easy, right? There was this faceless mini-boss in there that you'd fight, but he didn't really do too much damage. You know, he'd call down some waves from the ceiling that you had to dodge. There'd be some bombs that would spawn in, and you'd have to have players assigned to every single bomb to defuse every single bomb. But it wasn't all that difficult. It was more of an intermission. It was more of a breathing room than anything else. And that was definitely disappointing. It kind of felt like they had an initial plan for how this phase could work. They couldn't quite program it to work consistently, and they had to scrap it and come up with this phase as a filler, because that's kind of what it felt like. It felt like a bit of filler, and that definitely drags the ranking of N'Zoth down a little bit in my mind. It was definitely a disappointment. After the Mythic phase, though, you return to the N'Zoth room, and you essentially repeat phase 2, right? With your 4 waves of Evoke Anguishes, dropping them off, but this time there's different overlaps, and you're really starting to run out of space in the room and run out of sanity at this point as well. And so towards the end of the N'Zoth fight, things get really intense, where you've got laser beams forcing you to run, round space is almost entirely gone, the tanks are struggling to stay alive, people start to go insane and are burning the boss down with that damage buff, but then turning on their teammates. It got very hectic, but led to a very, very epic finish in my opinion. And yeah, that's why I really love this fight. But you put all that stuff together, and this is a fight that I really, really enjoyed. I thought there was interesting stuff for the tanks to do, with moving Psychus through his realm and positioning the Thought Harvesters properly in phase 2. There was interesting stuff for the healers, healing up the Psychus realm, where the damage taken could be very, very high, and then dealing with those Evoke Anguish casts, right? Very heavy incoming raid damage, while also having very high raid movement that could really mess with your cast. DPS had to deal with priority targets and really min-max their damage onto N'Zoth himself and plan where they're using their DPS cooldowns. And then of course everyone had to deal with mechanics like Paranoia, work together to handle that well, work together to handle the Mind Grasps, and so on. So yeah, for me, N'Zoth was a really epic and appropriate end boss of the expansion. I know that's not the popular idea that you're supposed to have, but that is genuinely how I feel. I really enjoyed progressing this boss. I had a great time. I thought it was a great boss. And yeah, like I said, I absolutely stand by that. My raid certainly, we had a great time doing it. So N'Zoth for me, number 2. In the number 1 spot then, the best raid boss of Battle for Azeroth. Of course, I think there's no question, there's no real surprise here, but it is Mythic Jaina, the final boss of the Battle of Dazar'alor. Jaina is one of the biggest and most beloved characters in the lore of World of Warcraft, going all the way back to Warcraft 3. So it was an incredibly epic moment to finally face up and actually fight against Jaina, and I think that Blizzard really did the character justice. One of my favorite little things that ran through the fight of Jaina was that Jaina, as a Frost Mage, as the ultimate real Frost Mage in World of Warcraft, had a lot of the typical Frost Mage tricks that she could turn against your raid group. So for example, Jaina would time warp herself and up her damage and start blasting your team. But hey, if you tried to time warp her, if you tried to use Bloodlust or Heroism on Jaina, she'd pop an ice block and sit in an ice block and just avoid all of your damage. It was a very funny and cheeky mechanic for Blizzard to add to the fight. Phase 1, you fight Jaina on her flagship. Now, interestingly enough, periodically during this phase, other Alliance ships are going to pull alongside and attempt to attack you, the Horde, right? So they're going to start shooting cannons at you. They're going to be dropping in adds to fight with Jaina and attempt to take you out. So you had to do a number of things to deal with these. In order to deal with the ships, there would be 3 ballistas on each side of Jaina's ship, which you could commandeer and fire to take down those ships. The way that we dealt with the adds that were coming in, because they could drop these barrels that you'd have to drop off the edge lest they explode and do massive damage to your raid, we actually used priests to mind control the adds that would come in from those ships and just run them off the edge, just force them to jump off the edge of the ship to their deaths thanks to our priest mind control. So that was a very interesting and different way to deal with them. On Mythic difficulty in particular, the extra Mythic mechanic that really defined this fight was that if you were separate from your team, that you would, after a few seconds, become frozen in an ice block. To be honest with you, phase 1 was quite long. There was a bit of randomness to it as well that could make it quite challenging. So for me, and I think a lot of other people, this was certainly the weakest part of the Jaina fight. Get past phase 1, and the fight starts to get really spectacular. Jaina would unleash this icy wave, freezing the seas around you, and she would teleport away into that frozen glacier, and you would then have to chase her down. In order to find Jaina, you'd have to split your team into 2 on Mythic and go down each side of this glacial basin. As you went around these sides searching for Jaina in the blizzard, and of course not being able to separate from your team lest you get frozen permanently, you'd have to be dealing with these frozen tornadoes and with these mirror images that Jaina would spawn around the encounter space, which would be flinging out these ice shards, these waves of ice shards. Again, if you touched an ice shard, you're instantly frozen and effectively almost definitely dead. Kill off the 5 mirror images and then interrupt Jaina to move into phase 2. And in phase 2, you're fighting Jaina, much as before, but on top of this, she now calls in her flagship, which is magically flying in the sky and bombarding you with magical cannon attacks. The most relevant part of the strategy, though, in phase 2 were 3 barrels that were dotted around the arena. From dropping the cannon attacks from the ship, on top of these barrels, you could actually ignite them, and the heat from this barrel would reset the cold debuff, the freezing debuff that was slowly building up on you from fighting Jaina in this icy basin. That cold debuff would be doing more and more and more frost damage to you, and could be a real hassle, a real challenge for the healers to overcome. So by breaking these barrels open at the right moments, you could then use their heat to reset that debuff. Of course, be careful, because after a few seconds, the barrel, well, it's explosive, it's going to explode. So you'd have to step in, reset your debuff, try stay in as long as you could, and then leg it away before that barrel explodes and murders you. The most dangerous mechanic in this fight, though, of course, was the Icefall. And this is actually pretty rough for players that initially were progressing on this fight. But with Icefall, a giant frozen comet would land on one side of the arena and then travel the entire way across that arena. Again, just doing massive damage and freezing anyone that it got hit by. The reason this was so damn nasty was that this could, at the start, overlap with the blizzard mechanic that was constantly going on during the fight, where once Jaina's blizzard had built up, you basically couldn't see more than a few feet either side. So you could absolutely, and this was a real problem for people during the race to world first, you could absolutely get caught in situations where your vision was entirely restricted, an icefall was coming in, and you had no idea where it was coming from. So you simply had to cross your fingers and hope. Thankfully, they did fix this later on, and they made sure that icefall would never overlap with the blizzard, so you'd never be caught in that situation. You were always able to see where it was coming from, adjust your positioning, and play around it. Once you brought Jaina to 40% health, having managed your usage of the explosive barrels correctly and ensuring that your freezing debuffs never got too high, you would enter intermission 2. At this point, Jaina will teleport to the center of the arena and start channeling flash freeze, right? So this expanding ring of ice would be coming from Jaina, and if it touched you, again, you would all be frozen and wipe. What did you have to do? Well, you had to smash a barrier, a wall of ice that was leading back the way you had came in order to escape the arena. After smashing the wall of ice and running up the passageway, you would find Jaina's Tide Elemental, which had frozen Nathanos Blightcaller. Break Nathanos free from his ice block, and he would fire an arrow that would interrupt Jaina's flash freeze and move you into the final phase of the fight. Jaina's Tide Elemental will be fighting you at the same time though, and this thing was no slouch. This could be quite dangerous, especially so on Mythic difficulty, where when you kill the Tide Elemental, it would then split into 2 smaller Tide Elementals, but these smaller Tide Elementals would still do just as much damage and just as many mechanics as the bigger guy. So for world first racers, what they had to do was actually just keep the Tide Elemental alive for the entire rest of the fight. They just did not have enough damage in order to kill the Tide Elemental and the 2 smaller ones and Jaina at the same time before they all ran out of stacks and got frozen and killed. By the time we got to it, and probably most players did it, Blizzard had toned this down a little bit so that you were actually able to kill the Tide Elemental and the 2 little Tide Elementals that spawned from it, so you'd only have to deal with their mechanics for a short amount of time. Either way though, whichever strategy you were going for, you would ultimately move into the final phase, phase 3 of the fight. This involves getting back to Jaina, who had teleported to another side of the arena and was channeling an arcane barrage, just flinging these waves of missiles at the ground around you that you would have to dodge while making your way back towards her. However, get to her, interrupt her, and the final race truly begins. With no barrels left to reset your frozen stacks, this very much was a race to the finish line, because once you reach 20 stacks of the chilling touch that Jaina was applying, you'd become frozen in an ice block. So one of the things that people would have to do to deal with this phase was intentionally get people frozen, right? Jaina would start firing out these frozen orbs during this phase, and in order to defeat the Orb of Frost, you would have to soak it, right? You'd have to absorb that Orb of Frost before it charged up fully and started hitting your raid. This would build up those chilling touch stacks on the players that soaked it, and it would let some of your raid get frozen before the others, and then the players that were left could break those players free. They'd get free now with their stacks reset, and then they would in turn free the other side of the raid, which would then get frozen, right? So you could kind of play around it a little bit like that. Of course, it's not as easy as it sounds, because Jaina, much like a good frost mage who gets bonus crit chance against frozen players, would start throwing shattering lances at any player that was frozen solid. So you would have only a few seconds from the point when someone became frozen to break them free before this ice lance would shoot out. It would also hit anybody else in the way. So you had to be very, very careful using this strategy where multiple players would get frozen, because this barrage of ice lances would just start tearing through that raid team and just wipe you out almost in seconds. To make this even more dangerous, Jaina would also summon in mirror images, which would keep casting those same abilities on you, again becoming very dangerous. So glacial rays, which would be almost one-shots and leave these permanent ice patches on the ground. Those shattering lances fired at frozen players would also be duplicated by the mirror images. And then even more dangerous perhaps, the Icefall ability, which was the giant comet that would just crash through and cover a massive chunk of the arena, would also be copied. So yeah, those mirror images were extremely dangerous. Now, this phase was a big race to the finish, very epic, very stressful, with this constant frost damage ticking up, this constant impending doom being a threat to you. And in my opinion, this was an awesome, awesome end to the best fight in BFA. I think for sure Jaina is going to be the fight that stands out in people's minds, that people are going to remember for years and years to come, especially so seeing as, you know, Mythic Jaina drops the best Mythic only mount in the entire expansion, so you're going to be going back and farming her, because that mount is awesome. It is well worth having. So yeah, there you go guys, they are my top 10 raid bosses from BFA. Let me know what you think. Do you agree with the list? What bosses did I leave off the list that you would have added on? What bosses did I put on the list that you definitely wouldn't have added on? But yeah, most importantly, I hope that you enjoyed the video and it was a little bit of a trip down memory lane for you. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, stick around, because we've got a whole new expansion in Shadowlands dropping in less than 2 weeks with its own rake of new raid bosses to take on together, which I'm very, very much looking forward to. But guys, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.